Did you know that over 1 million Australians can today trace their roots back to Italy? Well, in fact, as of 2022, even the President of Australia has Italian heritage. Don't believe me? Well, how did this come to be? And what drew the Italians to Australia? What challenges did they face in building new lives here? In this video, we'll explore the fascinating and at times challenging journey Italian Australians suffered. And in the end, I'll highlight some of the most successful Australians whose family stories began in Italy. Actually, two Italian mariners, Antonio Ponte from Venice and James Matra, served on board HMS Endeavour when Captain James Cook famously landed in Australia in 1770. Middle-class professionals from northern Italy migrated to Australia looking for a better life, rather than endure the occupation of northern Italy by the Austrian Empire, and this occupation lasted until 1860. Many Italian Australian families in Melbourne actually have histories which link back to the unsuccessful uprisings in Modena, Naples, Venice, Milan, Bologna and Rome in the 1840s. In the 1840s and 50s, Italian peasants and agricultural working class families looked for work in Australia. The Victorian gold rush caused Australia to invite European workmen for agriculture in New South Wales and Queensland. 2,000 Swiss Italians from Ticino headed for Daylesford and Hepburn Springs in Victoria. The challenging 2 to 4 month voyage from Europe to Australia past the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. It was hard, costly, infrequent and challenging compared to travelling to the United States and Latin America. Raffaello Carboni, writer and composer from Urbino, fled Italy after the fall of the Roman Republic. He wrote a book about the Eureka Stockade revolt. These were minor revolts against the British administration, and he was found not guilty for acts of treason. In 1881, there were 521 Italians in New South Wales and nearly 1,000 in Victoria. As the economic crisis bit in Italy from the 1880s, many Italians took up opportunities to settle in Australia as farmers, skilled or semi-skilled artisans and labourers. Italian immigrants had a lot of advantages. They had extensive knowledge of Mediterranean-style farming techniques, and these were considered ideal for cultivating Australia's harsh inlands. In 1882, a small group of immigrants from Veneto, northern Italy, arrived and they purchased land near Woodburn and founded New Italy. They also branched out into sugar industry, in timber squaring, grass seed gathering. In 1883, the Anglo-Italian Treaty allowed Italians reciprocal rights. This meant freedom of entry, travel, residence, and the right to acquire property and trade. In 1891, 300 peasants from northern Italy arrived in Queensland, and their purpose was to begin replacing 60,000 Kanakas. These were workers from Hawaii and the South Pacific Islands at the sugarcane plantations. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 was part of the wider white Australian policy. They wanted to keep non-Europeans out of Australia. Under this same legislation, Italians were also often refused entry, including famously at Fremantle, as they were required to write 50 words as dictated to them. Soon the immigrant Italians were a hot topic. Some locals protested that Italians would work harder than the Kanakas for lower pay, and this was undermining work from the local Australian population. The gold rush of the 1890s attracted unskilled workers, including Italians. As unemployment spread, Italian workers remained popular as they worked hard in hot weather for low wages. Soon the Italian migrants acquired sugarcane plantations and began to set up Italian communities in North Queensland. Italian workers were different. They lived frugally, often in tents, did not drink heavily, and saved large portions of their limited wages. Italians, Greeks, and Hungarians were considered as having a negative impact because they lowered wages, to the anger of the unions. This further stoked anti-Italian sentiment in the Queensland sugarcane industry and the Western Australian mines. In Western Australia, Italians branched out as fishermen, market gardening, ran restaurants and wine shops. In the cities, they worked as independent greengrocers, market gardeners and labourers, and some of them began setting up vineyards. In 1911, nearly 7,000 Italians were in Australia. Born in Italy, they were mostly males, and over 2,000 had become naturalised. Italian migration to Australia grew as entry to the United States and Canada became more difficult in 1917. A 1921 census recorded 8,000 Italians in Australia. By 1925, this was now over 20,000. The rise of fascism in Italy in 1922 triggered further outward emigration, as Italians did not need a visa to enter Australia. Concerned by the high level of outward migration of working populations, in 1927 Benito Mussolini acted. Italy and Australia informally agreed to limit the entry of 3,000 Italians per year. Peasants from Piedmont, Lombardy, Tuscany, Sicily and Calabria typically chose Australia as their destination. But when they arrived, both Italians and Sicilians faced hostility as they were considered inferior and were slow to integrate. The Italian culture made this worse, as they often deferred naturalisation until they had secured stable homes in Australia. The economic depression of 1929 caused a serious, prolonged recession which impacted everybody. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1932 was aimed at controlling the entry of white aliens into Australia, and this was only those with a maintenance guarantee. In 1933, 26,000 Australian residents were born in Italy compared to 8,000 in 1921. Italians were the largest non-English speaking ethnic group. They were predominantly male, and their wives and families only began to join them in the late 1930s. Riots broke out in the gold mining city of Kalgoorlie, Western Australia in 1934. A drunk Australian miner, George Edward Jordan, apparently made defamatory remarks about Claudio Mattabonian, an Italian barman who had previously ejected him. In the ensuing melee, George Edward Jordan hit his head and later died. A crowd of miners were enraged by what they considered was murder, and looted and burnt a number of Italian shops and houses in Boulder and Kalgoorlie. 3 died, including a Croatian, and there were nearly 90 arrests, and the gold mines were indeed closed for a week. As World War II broke out, Italians were subject to increased suspicion as enemy aliens. There were concerns that Italians would join a planned Japanese invasion of Australia. As Italy did join the war, 18,000 Italians were interned, especially in Queensland, South Australia and West Australia, and this did include some naturalised Italian Australians. Prisoners of war and interned Italian Australians worked hard in farms and cattle stations, and this improved their reputations amongst the general Australian population. The post-war Australian government initiative, Populate or Perish, sought to boost the population. The immigration debate restarted as the government planned a significant increase in the number and diversity of immigrants. The Displaced Person Scheme of 1947 attracted over 170,000 displaced persons to Australia in a 5-year period. Italian immigration to Australia increased as there was a more hospitable environment and they were more valued for their contribution to society. Return passage to Italy was very difficult, and so the number of naturalisations increased, including those who had been previously interned. By 1947, 80% of Italians were naturalised, but they were still not fully accepted as full-blown Australians. In the 1950s, Australia enabled the reunification of foreign families separated by the war. Australian and Italian governments negotiated a scheme of recruitment and assisted passage in 1952. Personally nominated immigrants had a guarantee of assistance and contacts on their arrival in Australia who would help them find employment. Migrants of the 1950s and 1960s planned to now settle permanently in Australia rather than return home after a period of work, as others had done before. Between 1947 and 1971, Australia's near 300,000 Italy-born residents were originally from Sicily, Calabria and Veneto. In 2001, it was estimated there were 30,000 Australian citizens now resident in Italy, and these were likely returned Italian immigrants. Australia is still seeing a wave of migration from Italy as working Italians flee the economic hardship in Italy. 20,000 Italians arrived in Australia in 2012-13 on temporary visas. In 2021, over 1 million people in Australia claimed full or partial ancestry. This is over 4% of the population. Modern-day Italian Australians have clustered in Melbourne with Little Italy. In Brunswick, people are typically from Ragusa and Vicini. In Sydney, people in Leichhardt are often from the Lipari Islands and Vicenza. So now let's look at the successful Australians and how they can be linked back to Italy. Tina Arena, singer with parents from Val Guarnera in Sicily. Nick Sester, singer-songwriter with the group Jet, and his father originated from Treviso and Pordenone. Joe Dolce, who famously upstaged Ultravox with a novelty song, was born to an Italian-American family. Natalia Imbruglia, singer, entertainer and actress in Neighbours. Her father was from Lipari. Bianca Censori, controversial model, architect, and often in stages of undress, next to Kanye West. Her grandparents were from Giulianova. David Campese, Australian rugby union player, has connections to Veneto. Daniel Ricciardo, Formula One racing driver, with family connections to Ficara, Messina, and Casignana, Calabria. Oscar Piastri, Formula One racing driver, with family connections to Liciana Nardi in Tuscany. In 2022, Anthony Albanese became Australia's first Prime Minister of Italian descent. His father was from Barletta, Apulia. Mark Philippoussis, tennis player, his mother was from Italian descent. Greta Scacchi, actress, her father originated from Milan. Click here to get even closer to Italy and Sicily.